The current manner in which activism is done does not aid in conservation efforts, but in fact impedes development of sustainable systems. Now hold on, eager activists. I'm not some climate change denying politician here to ruin your day. I'm simply performing a little thought experiment. Let's start with this. This conference was built upon the ideas of critical thinking communities, or CTCs. What are CTCs? Well, instead of giving a long-winded definition, how about I show you? One of the base skills of critical thought is analysis of one's own thinking patterns. So let's do just that. Let's think about how we think. Odd, yes, but this is a critical aspect of higher order thinking, so bear with me for a moment. I'm sure you remember the statement made earlier, right? Now I'm sure you've got an opinion already primed since the moment you heard it. Assessing and interpreting information as quickly as possible is a vital skill, and your personal lens is the only window you have to frame the world, so obviously it's going to be used. However, if we don't take a moment every now and then to stop and reassess the woodwork of those frames, we can rush forward with incomplete ideas. So, how do we assess that frame? Take a moment to look back at how you think. Remove yourself from your own skin and don't be afraid to give yourself a thorough criticism. Why did you respond to the statement how you did? If it made you angry, are you angry because you found a fallacy in that statement? Or because you've unconsciously found a fallacy in yourself? Are you uncomfortable yet? Good. Finding and acknowledging the flaws in our own ways of thinking, as uncomfortable as it may be, gives us the opportunity to buff them out and refine our lens. Christopher Hitchens said it best. The essence of the independent mind lies not in what it thinks, but in how it thinks. So, hopefully I've properly introduced the concept behind this event. This is not about how to cope with industries turning our green into their gold, nor arguing over lawmakers with Ben Franklin stuffed in their ears. This is about us, our lives, our lifestyles, and our own thoughts. Bring your own brain.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bring Your Own Brain, a symposium to free us from climate chaos. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Leonard Higgins. Leonard is retired from a 31-year career with Oregon State government focused on budget, contracts, and project management for large information technology projects. He believes in the Unitarian Universalist principles, including the inherent worth and dignity of every person and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part of. He was a co-founder of the Corvallis chapter of 350.org in 2012 and has been an organizer and participant in many social and climate justice efforts since then. Leonard was called to direct action in 2013 to support Native American nations in blocking transport through Oregon of tar sands extraction equipment. Along with other climate justice work, he continues to participate in direct actions, including the May 2016 two-day railway blockade of crude oil unit trains in Anacortes, Washington, during global break-free protests. On October 11, 2016, Leonard Higgins and 4 other climate activists closed safety valves on the 5 pipelines carrying tar sands crude oil into the United States, and he is here to tell all of us that story. Please join me in welcoming Leonard Higgins, as well as Michael Foster, who is another valve turner. Thank you, from Seattle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so pleased and honored to be here. This week has just knocked my socks off, just one speaker after another, and all of you. I want to talk a little bit about the 5 valve turners. I'm really happy that Michael was actually able to ride with us here and be here in person. He's going to talk at the end about some of the things that I thought would prevent him from being here. And we've saved the best for last. He'll be talking at the end before Q&A. But I also wanted to talk about the other valve turners just for a moment before I run a video that probably some of you have seen that does a good job in 7 minutes of kind of outlining what we did on October 11th. And so the 2 folks on the left, Emily Johnston and Annette Clapstein, they closed the tar sands valve in Minnesota. And Annette is what's called a raging granny. I don't know if you guys have heard of, there are gaggles of raging grannies, especially all over the United States and Canada. And this woman, both she and I are about the same age. I'm 65 and she's 64. We're the oldest of the 5. But Annette has been fighting the good fight, trying to stop the harm for a number of years, and most recently with the raging grannies. And Emily Johnston is a poet. She has a book of poetry about the effect of climate change on the non-human occupants of this planet that just really gets you where you live. She's a wonderful poet, a very outstanding activist, as is Michael with 350 Seattle. He can tell you more about what they're doing there. You've probably heard some of it. Seattle's really rocking it right now. And then Ken Ward just had his trial. He was the first of the 5 of us to go to trial. He went to trial in Mount Vernon, Washington. He had a number of charges to start with, including the coolest one, which was assemblage of saboteurs. Easy for me to say. But that was by far the coolest charge. That was actually dropped because he ended up not having the assemblage anymore, as they dropped the charges, as well they should, against the videographers, the folks covering the action in a journalistic way. And Michael will be talking more about himself, but I want to say a little bit. He has founded several organizations. His children are plaintiffs in the Children's Trust case against the state of Washington. He brought an organization called Plant for the Planet, and he can tell you about that. The James Hansen plan to ramp down on emissions includes the planting of 4 trillion? 1 trillion trees to work on not only stopping putting carbon into the atmosphere, but to draw that carbon down. He'll be talking more about that at the end. So that's the 5 of us, and I'll run that short video.
Basically, this is Leonard. It's going to be past these 2 legs here, kind of down this corner. There's a gate there and a gate there. That's what they're going to cut open, and they're going to do that at 8:30.
The group, which calls themselves Climate Direct Action, includes 5 activists and 4 other supporters.
Between 7:25 and 7:30, Ken will call Kinder Morgan, and at 7:30, he will close the valve.
When we fight, we win. Heard you guys say.
This is the only way we get their attention. This is the only way we can put a stop to it, is by putting our own bodies on the line, because all other avenues have been exhausted at this point. So for the sake of the children and the earth that we love, I'm ready to do this.
How you feel?
Somber and worried, but also serene.
What do I give it?
at this point, we have to do something. I think this has a very good chance of being making an important impact. So we got to try.
Climate activists were arrested Tuesday for attempting to shut down all tar sands oil coming into the United States from Canada by manually turning off pipelines in Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, and Washington State.
Johnson and Annette Clapstein. We're calling from Leonard, Minnesota. We're currently at the block valve sites for lines 4 and 67. Just 10 miles southeast from the Clearbrook pumping station. For the sake of climate justice and to ensure a future for human civilization, we must immediately halt the extraction and burning of Canadian tar sands. For safety, I am calling to inform you that when I hang up this phone, we are closing the valves. Please shut down these 2 pipelines now for safety and for our future.
Line 67 is being shut down. This is the one that they snuck in while we were fighting Keystone XL, so this feels particularly appropriate. Line 67 is shut down.
So here's the situation, and I'm calling to report that there are activists at a block valve site. Climate activists are preparing to shut the block valve. I'm calling to ask that you shut down the express pipeline, the Keystone pipeline, in approximately 10 minutes.
Approximately 10 minutes to plan on closing this?
Yes.
Your call will be directed to the control center. Your call may be recorded for quality purposes.
The plan is for them to shut down that valve in approximately 13 minutes. We want to make sure that you are aware of this situation so that the pipeline can be shut down in a safe manner, approximately 9 miles south of the Canadian border.
Keystone Pipeline, North Dakota. I'm Michael Foster. In order to preserve life as we know it and civilization, give us a fair chance and our kids a fair chance, I'm taking action as a citizen. I am duty bound.
This is what I'm called to do, direct action, actually putting myself in the way of the harm that's being done. It is so blissful to actually see a place where I can apply that calling, where I can take action that has a chance of making a difference.
I have been charged by the prosecuting attorney for Skagit County, Washington with 4 crimes: burglary, criminal trespass, sabotage, and assemblage of saboteurs for my action last Tuesday, closing a safety valve on the Trans Mountain pipeline and blocking the flow of Canadian tar sands oil from Alberta to the Anacortes refineries. There is no question about what I did. I live streamed it, and you can see the video at www.shutitdowntoday. The only question is whether what I did was an appropriate and practical response to what President Obama recently described as the terrifying climate conditions.
As a young person on this planet, I'm going to be living through this century, and any children I might have will also be living through these consequences.
If people are not acting as though there's an emergency, people don't believe that there's an emergency. And so for me, this is all about acting consistent with the threat that I'm seeing. I need the mic. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, especially as we started talking about what we did in the action. I was often introduced as the least likely to do direct action, to risk arrest. I'm probably, in the way I've spent my life and what I've done, I probably look very much like you students' parents or probably grandparents. And I want to introduce you just very briefly to my mentor. You students were really fortunate in having Jay, folks like Jay and Will and Dave act as mentors for you. That makes such a huge difference to have someone that can help you see outside the confines of your experience and help you think about things in different ways. And so Joanna Macy is one of my mentors. She's the mentor that transitioned me from having drank the Kool-Aid and being part of business as usual. When I married, I kind of bought into the whole American dream, the house, the car, the career, all of that. And so in a workshop in 2007 with Joanna Macy in Oregon, the two kind of top level things that I was exposed to were the work that reconnects Spiral. Her work in broad terms is called The Great Turning, a transition from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining civilization. And the work that reconnects is a preparation for activists, and that's not using the term activist just to refer to direct action and risking arrest. Joanna catalogs the work of the Great Turning into 3 dimensions. And so I want to talk about first the 4 parts of the spiral. There's opening up to gratitude. That's a very energizing and centering thing, to think about all the things that we have to be thankful. Just being alive in this world, and the natural world is such a huge part of that. The next is owning our pain for the world. I spent most of my life knowing in some deep, dark place that things were horribly wrong. And I think that so much of our culture has that same nagging thing. There's so much depression, so much anger, so much violence, I think comes a lot from that place of not really facing what's wrong and really grieving for that. And the purpose is to take that grief, to take that pain and convert it into energy for activism. It's going from being disabled and crippled by that pain to being energized by it. And then the third stage is seeing with new eyes, and the fourth is going forth into the work for the Great Turning. And so Joanna describes the Great Turning having 3 dimensions of work. There's the work that I've focused on, but I want to say it's not the only place I'm putting my energy, but it is, especially with the valve turning. We didn't commit just to that single day of action. We committed to what we thought would be a year or more of leveraging that action to get whatever attention we could to the crisis that we're in, talking about it, educating, maybe inspiring others to find what they're calling in the Great Turning, which dimension that they might focus on. And so the first is actions to slow the damage to the earth and all beings on the earth. The second is an analysis, very much what you guys, the purpose of this conference, analysis of structural causes and the creation of structural alternatives. And we've heard so many inspiring things this week from the speakers in that regard. And then I want to read a little bit about the shift in consciousness. The structural alternatives that we're coming up with, partly in this conference, can't take root and survive without deeply ingrained values to sustain them. They must mirror what we want and how we relate to the earth and each other. And I heard some of this in the talk that Dave gave, really wanting what we desire, wanting what we really need. They require, in other words, a profound shift in our perception of reality. And that shift is happening now, both as a cognitive revolution and spiritual awakening. The insights and experiences that enable us to make this shift are accelerating, and they may take many forms. They arise as grief for our world, giving the lie to old paradigm notions of rugged individualism, the essential separateness of the self. They arise as a glad response to breakthroughs in scientific thought, as reductionism and materialism give way to evidence of a living universe. And they arise in the resurgence of wisdom traditions. I'm so glad that we added Joseph Grady to the schedule. I really appreciated his comments and conversation with Derek Jensen, really talking about the sickness that infected the European traditions that gave rise to wars of conquest, to domination and exploitation of people and all living life. Reminding us again that our world is a sacred whole, worthy of adoration and service. And so I want to, as you can see, Joanna's 80, I think she's 84 now. She's been doing wonderful work for 50 years and just such an inspiration to me. I wanted to emphasize that the timing and a good part of the impetus for the action was solidarity with Standing Rock. All of us were not only so inspired by the power and the effectiveness of it, but also the resonance with the values that we hold, a very strict adherence to nonviolence, a deep reverence to the sacredness of life, and a spiritual tradition. And I don't think a spiritual tradition is just having to do with religion. For example, Emily and Annette, I think both would say that they don't adhere to a spiritual tradition, but both of them are such a great example of people that just really are in touch with how sacred life is. And then finally, before kind of doing an outline of the rest of the time together, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the five of us. Bill McKibben, when he talked to us, talked about the unique responsibility of us older folks, that the impact of direct action, the threat of arrest, don't make nearly as much difference for us at the end of our life as it does young folks that are just beginning their life. And the five of us, as you might notice, we're all up there in years, we're all white, we've lived very privileged lives, and when we take direct action, when we risk arrest or are arrested, that privilege results in us being treated much differently than marginalized folks, whether they're people of color or other marginalized communities. I won't go into that. I'm sure that you've experienced it or seen it. So to talk about an outline of where we're going from here, we've got Marla Marcum with the Climate Disobedience Center, which is a strong partner both in supporting the action and supporting us legally, and in helping us decide how we can continue this work. And then we'll have Alice Cherry and Ted Hamilton with the Climate Defense Project. these three folks, Alice, Ted, and Kelsey Skaggs, are recent Harvard Law graduates, and they've chosen to dedicate their time as newly past the bar attorneys to form a nonprofit to defend folks that are taking direct action and are being arrested. And so Alice and Ted will be joining us. It's not Skype, it's similar. It's a software called Zoom that they'll be, hopefully if I can get the technology to connect, they'll be joining us. After that, Michael's going to be talking to us, telling us a little bit more about himself and his unique perspective on what we did and why, and something we're calling Children's Trust and Reflections. And then we'll be aiming to leave about an hour. We'll try to get through this so that there's a good hour of time just to have Q&A and just be able to talk about things. And so I will try to see how am I doing on time. I'll try to see if I can connect with those that are calling in. Awesome.
Hey, Leonard.
Hey, you guys are all there. Wonderful. And so I'll turn the.
Wow. Hi.
So I'll introduce you. We have from top and left to right, Marla Marcum with the Climate Disobedience Center, Ted Hamilton with the Climate Defense Project, and Alice Cherry with, both Ted and Alice with the Climate Defense Project. And I wanted to just take a moment to tell you guys how awesome this conference has been. There have been probably at least 5, if not 10 presenters that have really knocked my socks off. Angela and I each evening have just had so much to talk about, and so I'm really glad that you guys can join us. Where we're at, we've shown the video showing the October 11th valve turner action. I've talked a little bit about what transitioned me from a business as usual kind of life into activism. We've added at the end, Michael's going to do, after you guys talk about the Climate Disobedience Center and the Climate Defense Project, he's going to talk about the Children's Trust law cases and just some reflections from the time here at the conference. And then I'm hoping that all 3 of you will be able to stay with us for about an hour of conversation afterward. Will that work for you?
I'll be here. I will too.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I'll, I think, did I go over the outline for how we're going to spend the time? I did. Okay. So Marla, I'll just turn it over to you to talk about what the Climate Disobedience Center is and what it does, and the support that you've given to the valve turner group and the crossover with Ken and Jay between your work and what we did on October 11th. And then if you could just introduce Alice and Ted from there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Wow, so Leonard, I'm getting some feedback. Maybe you can mute on your end while I'm talking. Great, thank you. I just saw the shirt for the event where you all are on Leonard. It's pretty great. And I'm really excited to be with you today. Again, my name is Marla, and I'm one of the founders of the Climate Disobedience Center, and I direct the center. And so this organization actually came about after Ken Ward and Jay O'Hara, who were both involved with valve turning action. So Ken was one of those valve turners, and you've probably heard a little bit about him and his trial, or maybe not yet. We'll see. But or his 2 trials so far for the valve turning actions. And Jay was the person you saw in the video who was on the phone making phone calls from a remote location to the companies to make sure that they knew where the valve turners were about to turn those valves so they would shut the pipelines down safely. So Ken and Jay did an action on May 15th in 2013 that we refer to as the lobster boat blockade, and you can actually still find out about it if you looked up lobsterboat.org. The website is still up. But they blocked the delivery of 40,000 tons of mountaintop removal coal coming in on a big tanker, like a 600-foot long tanker, to the Brayton Point Power Station in Massachusetts. And I was part of the group that helped to plan that action, and I was sort of holding down the support team on the shore and talking to the media while they were blocking that ship. They dropped a big anchor that was impossible for humans without any mechanical help to pull up, and they were in the way so that the tanker couldn't deliver the coal. Of course, eventually their boat got moved out of the way, and but they actually weren't arrested that day. It was interesting. They got charged later, and by the time we had been through a trial for this action, there had been other people taking action on the shore at that power plant. There had been 48 arrests at one time. There had been blockading the entrance. There had been a group of 200 people who marched for 70 miles from that plant, which was the last big coal plant operating in Massachusetts, to out to the middle of Cape Cod to call for a move from coal to Cape Wind when we were still trying to get that wind farm built. Never got built, but some other ones did. And then by November of that year, we had gotten a shutdown date for the Brayton Point Power Station. And that wasn't just because of what we did, but we think we helped a little bit because we saw a strategic opportunity to use nonviolent civil disobedience to raise the profile of a coal plant that actually was being sold. It was in the middle of being sold, and the company that was buying it didn't even want it. But they did want those other 2 coal plants they were buying along with it in Illinois. And the deal was you have to buy this other one too. So we knew they didn't even want to operate it. And so we took the opportunity to put some strategic pressure on. And when you do something beautiful, like put a lobster boat in front of a 600-foot coal tanker, a 32-foot lobster boat, you can really motivate other people to take bolder action and to actually imagine that you could do something like shut down the biggest coal plant north of Maryland, I think it was at the time. A lot of people just hadn't thought to dream that that was possible. So then we wanted to use the trial as an opportunity for organizing, and I'll let Alice and Ted tell you a little bit more about the necessity defense, but we were attempting this defense called the necessity defense that maybe you've also heard a little bit about from Leonard, but it essentially says it was necessary for us to take this action in order to prevent a greater harm. And a judge had allowed us we were going to be able to present this defense. And then the district attorney, the prosecutor, showed up on the day of the trial and dropped the charges and said that he agreed that climate change was the gravest crisis that humanity has ever faced. He had a copy of Bill McKibben's Rolling Stone article. It was about 2 weeks before the first People's Climate March in New York City, and he announced that he was going to march with us in New York City, and he did. He brought his whole family and his staff, and it was kind of wild. And we realized in that moment that we had forgotten to expect much of our elected leaders, and We had forgotten to expect that they might be on our side. We had a plan for everything else. We had a plan for them being convicted and sentenced that day and taken straight to jail. We had a plan for if they dropped the charges, we had bought another boat. We were gonna go get in a boat and do it again. In fact, I was in the process of making that happen when I was told, hold on, something else is happening. And so we realized that, that this opportunity, and way more people heard about the action, and we had given the district attorney an opportunity to make a difference about climate change, something he really cared about, but didn't have a lot of extra time to go to organizing meetings or come to an event like the one where you are. And we had brought that opportunity into his sphere of power in the world. And so we realized that maybe we needed to keep working together to keep bringing the opportunity to make a difference, and to use the power that some unlikely allies might have in the world if we kept doing actions that felt to them like an opportunity. And we wanted more people who just decided that they had tried all of the regular, the regulatory, the legal pathways open to us that are supposed to allow us to make a difference in the process. And I think a lot of you probably know, trying to oppose new infrastructure often just feels like you're facing a rubber stamp machine. And you're given an opportunity to make comments, but it often feels like our comments aren't listened to. So we wanted to make sure that people who felt like the only thing left for them to do was to put themselves in the way, that those people had some support. And since we felt like we had some experience of like taking an action through all the way to trial and using that as an organizing experience to bring more people into the work, that we had something to offer other people, so that they wouldn't feel quite as lost and confused and without any resources as we did when we started that part of the work. And so, so Ken and Jay and I and Tim DeChristopher, who had joined us for the trial prep, decided to launch the Climate Disobedience Center in the fall of 2015. And I'll encourage you all, if you're interested to know more, to look at our website, climatedisobedience.org. If you look for our principles, so that's climatedisobedience.org/principles, you can see the list of principles that we agreed on from the beginning of founding the organization, that we said these principles are gonna govern our work together. And it's been a real joy to be part of an organization that doesn't just say that, but when we disagree, we actually say to each other, we can't make a decision. We say to each other, well, what do the principles say? And we actually use them to help us make decisions, which has been amazing because I think all of us, as we enter this work, it's kind of scary. If you enter this work, it might feel scary, it might feel uncertain. And one of the most important things that we recognize needs to be done is that we need to build communities of support and trust with one another. We need to do that no matter what. But in order to empower people to feel like they could take a risk that they might not otherwise have felt like they were able to take, but now feel compelled to, if we can build these communities of support and give people tools to support one another all the way through the trial process, then people might be willing to take greater risks than they've been willing to take before. And so that's what we're about. We have a revolving legal defense fund that we don't publicize because it doesn't have $1 million in it, but when people get themselves into some good trouble, if you know some, they can call us and we can maybe help them out a little bit. If we can't help them find a pro bono attorney through the people I'm about to introduce, then we can help a little bit with paying for attorneys. And mostly we are available, we see ourselves as a support center to help with training, to get people ready to take an action, to help with envisioning, help you envision what kind of action or what kind of statement you want to make, all the way through trial support and organizing for that, and organizing support if there is an incarceration. So we hope that you'll let us know what we can do to support you, and we of course would love your support going forward.
Before you introduce Alice and Ted, could you take just a minute or two to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you. Oh, and I didn't say what we did. We did some of all of those things with the valve turners, which I know Leonard had asked me about. I know the date of the valve turner action. Well, you saw in the video what Jay did, and you saw what Ken did. Tim DeChristopher and I were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the outdoor patio at the public library all day, calling through all of the media contacts that we were encouraging to cover the story. And so we were doing interviews and that kind of work all of that day. And then my big work with the valve turners since the action was to help their team of supporters learn how to prepare for and organize for a trial and make sure people felt supported and resourced to get there and show up in the way that the defendants want them to show up. I grew up in rural central Missouri in the Ozarks. And I went to college in Tennessee at a little place called Sewanee. I started out in physics as a major, and I ended up with a degree in religion and Russian. And then I lived in Utah for a couple of years doing a stint in AmeriCorps. And then I ended up in Boston at Boston University School of Theology. And I like to say when I got to School of Theology, I discerned a call to the laity, so I thought I might want to serve a church. But I figured out that my work, even if I consider it to be ministry, is in the world outside of the church. And so I did a Master of Theological Studies degree in philosophy, theology, and ethics. And I did half of a doctorate there in ecological ethics, and it got to the point in 2009 when I took a leave of absence and then another leave because I began to feel like the world was burning, and then I left that program because I felt like I didn't need a terminal degree in my field to help build the grassroots climate movement. So in that time, in 2009, I was part of the team that organized for the first 350.org International Day of Climate Action. It was in late October of 2009. I was part of the team that organized the Boston event. And at that point, it was the biggest climate gathering that had ever happened in Boston, which was 1,500. We've far surpassed that by now. And then the next year, I joined with some folks to found an organization called Better Future Project, which in 2011 launched the 350 Massachusetts network. So 350 Massachusetts is based out of this organization, Better Future Project. So I helped to build both of those. And then in 2015, I decided to move on and focus more intensely on this resistance part of the work. And while we were building the Climate Disobedience Center, I also then started working with an organization, well, building a little grassroots organization with no staff in Boston called Resist the Pipeline. And we actively resisted through nonviolent civil disobedience for a year the construction of a new lateral pipeline, frac gas pipeline into Boston. We didn't win. The pipeline wasn't quite long enough for us to build our momentum in time, but we did have 198 arrests over the course of that, and we still have 16 defendants trying to move for a necessity defense trial. So I live in the Boston area. And I'm excited to introduce to you my friends Alice Cherry and Ted Hamilton, who they can tell you more about themselves. I won't try to tell the story of how their organization was founded, but I'm really grateful and excited to be a member of the board of the Climate Defense Project, which they launched last year. Yeah, it was just last year in the fall, maybe. Yeah, and at the Climate Disobedience Center, we understand ourselves to be building who we are and what we do in collaboration with these folks, and they're filling a niche in the work on the sort of legal defense side, but also on the legal offense side that that we really need to see grow. And I'm excited that they're the ones building it because they've done some extraordinary work. It's been exciting to work with them so far across like one action where we actually worked together with them on the legal team, and I was on the action team, and more of that to come, I'm sure. So Alice and Ted.
Thanks, Marla. So I guess since we're doing biographies, I'm obliged to say something about myself. My biography is not nearly as interesting as Marla's. I grew up in a small town in Illinois. I studied some environmental issues in college. Somehow ended up in law school. I'm still not quite sure how that happened, but it was a good thing because I met, among other people, Ted, who's also on this call, and Kelsey, and those were the two people that, Ted Hamilton and Kelsey Skaggs, the two people that I started working with for Climate Defense Project after law school. So anyway, Climate Defense Project is just a nonprofit. We're based in Berkeley, California, but we kind of work all over the place. One of our co-founders, Ted, he's going to talk about the necessity of defense in a little more detail. That's what Marla mentioned a little earlier. But before we do that, I'll just give you a very quick overview of what Climate Defense Project does and kind of the legal status of the Valve Turner cases. Climate Defense Project was started last fall by, as I said, Kelsey, Ted, and myself. We had gotten to know each other because when we were in law school, we were all part of a student-led campaign calling on our university to divest its financial holdings in fossil fuel companies. You've probably heard of these campaigns. They're happening all over the country. And they were pioneered, of course, by Bill McKibben, who I discovered is also speaking at this conference. So I won't say too much more about that. But anyway, Kelsey and Ted and I, along with some other students, brought a lawsuit against our university to try to compel it to divest from fossil fuel companies. It was the first lawsuit that did that. And although the case ended up being dismissed, the experience was valuable because it showed us how legal filings and courtroom arguments can become part of a broader social justice campaign and can actually help amplify that campaign regardless of the technical legal outcome of the case. I know people like to say this, but it really is true that you can lose in court but still win in the court of public opinion. And the legal system, believe it or not, does actually tend to pay attention to public opinion, at least in the long run. So the three of us graduated from law school, and we were feeling like we wanted to do something a little more creative than typical lawyer work. And one thing we had noticed is that very few lawyers have a kind of a movement-focused model. In other words, very few lawyers see themselves and their work as a constituent part of a broader social movement. There are some historical examples of this, like with the civil rights movement, for instance. And there are some lawyers today who do specialize in the criminal defense of activists and political protesters, for instance. But the really astonishing thing is that no one is yet playing that role for the climate movement in any kind of a comprehensive way. Even though the climate movement, as we know, is growing rapidly and more people are engaging in civil disobedience and other activities that have legal risks. So the three of us decided that someone should be working in that space and it might as well be us. And so since last fall, we've been helping out with the Valve Turner cases. You saw that video, so I won't go over kind of the facts of that action or what happened. We've mostly been working with the local attorneys representing each of the Valve Turners in the 4 different states where the action happened, and making sure that those attorneys have the resources that they need, whether that's just legal research or expert witnesses or anything in between. So to summarize the legal status, after that action, the prosecutors in the various states filed charges against each of the Valve Turners. And they also, by the way, filed some charges against the documentary filmmakers, although those charges have since been mostly dropped or negotiated to be conditional. But the charges were fairly draconian, the ones that were filed against the Valve Turners. In Ken's case, the prosecution actually revived a fairly little used portion of the state criminal code that had originally been enacted to kind of suppress the labor movement way back in I think it was the 19-teens or the 1920s. And all of the Valve Turners received felony charges. So as of right now, only one of those cases has actually gone to trial, and that's Ken Ward's case. The other cases are expected to go to trial either later this summer or this fall, so you can stay tuned for those. So Ken actually had 2 trials because the first one was a mistrial. So back in late January in Washington State, at his first trial, the jury deliberated for about 5 hours, but was unable to reach a decision as to whether Ken should be convicted of either of the charges that were leveled against him. And so what happened is that it's kind of a technical legal thing, but the jury was hung and the judge kind of had to declare a mistrial in that case, which was a huge victory for Ken and for the entire movement, because mistrials are exceedingly rare. And for reasons that Ted will explain, Ken was actually at a disadvantage in that trial as well as in his second trial. So it's even more amazing that he got the outcome that he did. After the mistrial, the prosecutor could have decided not to refile the charges, but he did. So there was another trial just last week, actually, also in Washington State. And at that trial, the jury did convict Ken of one of the charges against him, but it was the less serious charge. So they actually still hung on the more serious charge. It's called a sabotage charge. And so just the fact that Ken was able to get that result twice in a row is really pretty remarkable. So to understand kind of why that was such a big deal, it kind of helps understand what goes on exactly in these trials. Ken's entire defense strategy rested on this legal argument that Marla referred to called the necessity defense. And the judge had actually made a ruling before the trial that said that Ken wasn't allowed to present that particular defense. And he also wasn't allowed to put on, any witnesses that would have been part of that defense. So the necessity defense is really key in political protest cases, not just in Ken's case, and it's being used more and more by climate protesters in particular. And at this point, I'm gonna hand it over to Ted, who's gonna talk to you about more of the particulars of the defense and how it has played out in some recent cases.
Thanks, Alice, and hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here. Wish we were there in person. So my name is Ted Hamilton. As Alice said, I am a co-founder of the Climate Defense Project. I'm from outside Boston originally. Also had a somewhat circuitous path to environmental activism and law. I really just started to become very concerned about climate change in the years after college and wanted to do something that felt pretty engaged in the actual climate movement, but also operating in the realm of ideas and theories and how we can rethink our relationship to the planet and to society with this crisis. And law school proved to be a pretty good way of combining those two different sorts of practice or ways of thinking about the climate crisis. So as Marla and Alice have mentioned, a lot of attention in the climate movement has been paid recently to this idea of the climate necessity defense, which I think one of its main purposes is to amplify on-the-street action and protests and to extend activism into the courtroom. Basically what the climate necessity defense is it's an argument that a protest defendant will bring to the court asking that the jury find them innocent by reason of necessity. In other words, you're trying to get legal recognition that your actions were justified, that blocking a coal train or interfering with the construction of a pipeline was necessary given the threat that infrastructure poses to society, given the threat of climate change. I'm going to really briefly describe the basic legal requirements of this defense, how it works in practice, and then what some of the more practical purposes from an organizing point of view are of using the defense. To prove that a protest was necessary, to argue that you should be not guilty by reason of necessity, you have to show basically 4 things. 1, that you are facing an imminent harm, which in this case is climate change. 2nd, that you acted to prevent that harm and that there was some connection between your action and actually preventing the harm. 3rd, that what you're doing to prevent the harm is not more harmful than the harm itself. And 4th, You need to show that there were no reasonable legal alternatives to your harm. To your protest. In the context of climate protest, that basically means that the imminent harm is climate change. Something you did was intended to prevent or ameliorate or mollify, do something to address climate change. That your protest was not worse than climate change, which is pretty easy to prove. And that the legal alternatives to protest are, lobbying Congress, bringing other lawsuits, whatever it might be, are really not working. In practice, criminal defendants usually have to propose this defense to the court before they go to trial. In other words, they ask the judge, can I present this necessity defense? I think I have enough evidence to prove it to a jury. In almost every climate necessity case so far, prior to trial, the judge has decided, no, you cannot bring a necessity defense. I don't think that there's enough evidence. The issues that tend to come up in this pre-trial argumentation with the judge usually focus around two of those elements that I mentioned. The first one about the imminence of climate change, and the fourth one about the reasonable legal alternatives. Now, despite what we all know about the realities of climate change and climate science, lots of judges have called into question the reality of climate change, or they've argued that it's not really an imminent harm. You can't look out the window and see climate change. If we wait another day or two, the world's not going to end. And so this is honestly, often a question of framing. Is this an imminent harm or not? On the question of reasonable legal alternatives, the counter argument that we keep running up against is judges and prosecutors assume that you should just keep trying to elect different officials, that you should keep lobbying Congress to do something about climate change. And of course, while we support all those tactics as well, our argument and the argument of plaintiffs and lawyers who are bringing these defenses is look at the past few decades. We've been trying this through these reasonable legal alternatives. The world is burning. It's time we do something else. We think that the climate necessity defense is close, and maybe in the near future, in the next couple of years, we might get a defendant who gets acquitted by reason of necessity. And that would be a great moment for the climate movement, because it would be, again, this legal recognition that this sort of protest is necessary to deal with the climate crisis. But even without that not guilty verdict by reason of necessity, there's a lot of great things that a necessity trial can do. On the one hand, those arguments I was describing that happened prior to trial with the judge, those really flesh out and underscore some of the really key questions we have to confront as a society when we're dealing with our response to climate change. How do we think about harms? What does imminence mean? What are the best societal and establishment or institutional methods of dealing with climate change? Those are very important and pressing conversations that need to happen. And by doing them in a courtroom, we're able to bring factual evidence and to have a dialogue that we promote, and we, hopefully the public will learn something through that whole battle. On the educational front as well, these trials, as Marla mentioned with the lobster boat example, they present a really great opportunity for organizing and for PR and for general education about climate change. Because Americans tend to love courtroom drama, people pay attention to trials, and you get a lot of great headlines, and you get a lot of really this kind of dramatic presentation of what's at stake in the climate movement through the form of a single trial, a single group of activists. It's also an opportunity to educate the jury. And so in many instances where we've had climate necessity trials, jurors have come up to defendants after the case is done and said that they really learned a ton about climate change, and that after their experience hearing about climate change, they want to get involved in the movement themselves. On that point about what jurors think about what is necessary to address climate change, one thing that we've seen through these trials is that it really serves a democratic function by bringing these questions back to normal people. Juries are supposed to represent a group of your peers, and if you can convince a group of your peers that what you are doing in terms of climate direct action is necessary, that's a very powerful moment. And one of the reasons why it's so important to press the climate necessity defense and to seek jury trials is because judges are often pretty far removed from that sort of knowledge or that sort of decision making. When judges decide prior to trial that they don't think anyone would ever believe this necessity argument, they're basically assuming that you would not be able to prove to an average group of jurors that breaking the law to address the climate crisis is necessary. But we've seen in a series of recent trials that that's actually the opposite of the truth. Jurors have said, if I had had a legal way to acquit you, to find you not guilty, I would have, because I admire what you're doing. And so we're pushing for the legal ratification of that idea. And so, yeah, that's basically the idea behind the climate necessity defense and the Climate Defense Project, along with CDC and a few other groups. We're trying to build up the law to make sure that this gets recognized. We're trying to bring in different sorts of climate expert witnesses and witnesses on the efficacy of civil disobedience, again, to serve that sort of educational purpose and organizational purpose, all with the idea of using the legal system as just another front in the fight for climate justice. So I think now we will definitely hang out for questions. I think we may just mute ourselves and block our videos so we're not a source of mutual distraction. But thanks again for giving us the opportunity to chat with you guys.
Thanks very much. I'll leave the audio on while Michael's presenting. If you could come up, Michael.
Okay, so I've got 10 minutes and this will only take about 3 hours, so sit tight. What did Derek say? Our intellect just convinces us how we can do what we really wanted to do in the first place, right? We're so clever. We've invented and discovered so many things in Western civilization. But when the people who lived here first saw my grandparents coming, they knew something was wrong. They knew something was different about these people who needed sunscreen. Only after the last tree has been cut down, only after the last river has been poisoned, only after the last tree or last fish has been caught, only then will you find money cannot be eaten. It was so simple to them. Why is it so hard for us to understand some of these really basic things? Because we're not of this place, because we came here to take this place and force them out and turn whatever was here into a thneed, right? We all need a thneed. Unless, right, this is inevitable. This is inevitable. And I was a dad reading the Lorax to my kids, tucking them in every night. God, that was my favorite time of the day. That was my religion. And this was inevitable, unless, does anybody remember the last line? Somebody like you cares a whole awful lot. Nothing will get better. So, I'm a mental health counselor by trade, or I was. You know, people could change their feelings about this and things are still not going to get better. There's a physical reality here. So we could change our feelings, our thoughts, or our behavior. Behavior is the thing we have to change climate, change behavior, right? How do we do that? How do we stop people from wanting more and more and more and taking it? This is all the water on Earth in a globe, up there, the big one. That's the water in the sky, the clouds inside you and me and your dog. That's all of the stuff underground that we've been pumping out. That's all of it in a ball the size relative to the globe. The small ball is what we call the unsalted variety. We like to drink it. The drinking water, actually, though, is the tiny little dot. You may not be able to see it in the back, right where Atlanta is. That's the fresh water we have access to. Planet's not making any more. It's 1 billion years worth of water right there, and it's flowing through you right now with all kinds of unacceptable levels of chemicals and toxins in it. That's your blood. I'm 70% water, I think. That's what I learned in school. So you could call me Mike, or you could just call me water. I mean, what am I? And if you look at my DNA, 95% of my DNA, my genetic material, is not me. It's the bacteria and stuff that helps me digest food. I am just a host. What does it mean to be a human? I mean, we can noodle on these things for a long time, but the point is, I am a permeable bag of water sloshing around the room here. I leak. I'm full of stuff and air which comes in and becomes me, and then I breathe it out and it becomes air again, like magic, right? There is no nature. There is no wilderness. I am it. It is me. That's all, right? These boundaries, these things that we set up to define and divide and separate are just trapping us and making us feel powerless to stop something that we are doing to ourselves. So, good folks at Standing Rock decided they would go out and pray. No weapons. Pray. How do you stop a multi-billion-dollar oil pipeline? How do you bring a corporation to heel? You pray. Oh boy, that's going to work. Martin Luther King was in Birmingham jail, and he said when a person challenges the law and is willing to face the punishment, it arouses the conscience of the community and shows ultimate respect for the law. He said, we don't create the tension. We just bring the tension to the surface. It's not a passive resistance. I have to stand in the seat of power and challenge it and refuse to give way because I love, I'll say this, very selfishly. I don't know about altruism. I know about loving what I love. Loving my kids, my family, this place. It's me. That's all I will ever be. It's a very selfish thing to care about a person or a place or a thing enough to do something about it. This was so completely overwhelming compared to what this little, spy operation that we did, shutting down. We shut down 15% of the nation's oil supply for a day. Woohoo! It was awesome. It was awesome. I got to turn off the Keystone Pipeline. Are you kidding me? That's awesome. I can't believe I got to do that. I can't believe I got to do that, right? I got to do that because I couldn't not do that. I've been dreaming about this stuff, having nightmares about this stuff. Got to do something. What's possible? What needs doing? What's not being done? Let's do that. Right? Let's do that. So, but what they did was completely different. Of the place, indigenous. We become indigenous again, of the place. And we become vulnerable. So I went and became an Al Gore speaker, did a thing, went into schools with my Al Gore slideshow, put some kids from Germany with this organization called Plant for the Planet. Fourth graders started it. Then they become the United Nations tree counters. Their goal is to plant 1 trillion trees worldwide. That's a lot of trees. That's a million. And leave fossil fuels in the ground and combat poverty with climate justice. This is for fourth graders, right? Fourth to middle school. 350.org doesn't have anything like this. And this is backed up by some great economics and great physical science. So I started having these little free workshops for kids, and we got a club going, and I got several clubs going. I'm very proud of this picture with Mr. Gore and Governor Jay Inslee. The kids were introducing Jay in front of Al because we did some backroom conversations and emails and things, and it was wonderful because these gentlemen don't know that at this moment this picture was being taken, these kids were suing their ass. Yeah! These kids were suing their ass for a plan to stop the inevitable destruction of everything we love, everything that we owe to them. The public trust doctrine. It goes back before the Constitution. It's in there in the Constitution. It's implied in our state constitution, federal constitution, in Justinian Code. One generation may not destroy the essential resources for the next. We went to court on the basis of this. And this case has been lost all over the country. And I met this lawyer. We decided we're going to do it again. It's a complicated backdoor thing. We got in through an administrative rule and won the first time in U.S. history that the judicial ordered the government to fix climate. We couldn't believe it. Oh my God, it's happening. Your Washington State, this is a thing now, Foster v. Ecology. Every kid in Washington State not only has the right, you all have this right. Every young person has the right. In Washington State, it's spelled out in a judge's ruling, the government must preserve Washington's essential resources, air and water, which these young people will require to grow to adulthood safely. Not bad. They also won, get this, the right for ecology to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The Department of Ecology argued that they didn't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? So that when the kids won their first ruling, it was that ecology gets to do their job. Really. We are in an insane time. It's double speak all over again, right? So they won this constitutional ruling. They met with the governor and the Department of Ecology, more double speak. Oh my gosh, I felt so terrible. Imagine a 12-year-old sitting down with the greenest governor in the country and the Department of Ecology. You know, it's their job to regulate and protect the environment. And these people would not say any of the things that these kids were asking them to discuss in private meetings, off the record. They couldn't evoke a direct answer to a direct question, and they were losing it. They were losing it. Anyway, that sort of thing went on. Governor appealed the case after raising funds by telling everybody, hey, if you love clean air and you love these kids who are winning this lawsuit, donate here. And then 10 days later, he appealed the ruling. These are the things that made me want to turn off a pipeline, right? The case moves on. We've got a clean air rule because of the case. It's garbage. It's worse than nothing. It legalizes more pollution. Green groups in Washington State are pushing a carbon price right now, end of this month. I am arguing with the kids that we must not allow this to happen because it is legalizing more pollution. These limits are meaningless. It's not going to stop anything. Sometimes nothing is better than something, and this is one of those cases. You have to know what's in the policy. Case is moving forward, but what do they get if they win? What if they win the big one, you know, like the Grand Slam, the World Series? James Hansen Science from a few years back, to protect young people, future generations, and nature. If you haven't read it, this is the blueprint, the Magna Carta. This is the physical science written for judges of what we must do if we care a whole awful lot. There's a number to get back to 350. When the study came out, 6% a year decline in fossil fuels would get you there. It was 2013. We're a little late. We didn't start. If you also put 100 gigatons of carbon back in the ground, the soil, and the forests, That's about 10 years worth of human pollution. So if anybody asks you, is it too late? Yes, it is. You can't just throw your keys into the river, right? Stop driving. You have to plant those trees. That is not optional. 10 years worth of human pollution has to go back into the ground really quickly. Okay? This is geoengineering, right? Trees are the most elegant form of geoengineering we know. Then you get back to 350, the upper red line for climate, near the end of my kid's lifetime. I apologize. I grew up across the street from Shell Oil. Exxon was across the bay in Houston, Texas. All the guys that I went to school with are working there and making these decisions. And I profited from, I owned 12 gas cars in my life, whatever. That was nothing. Most people don't know how many cars they've owned. Fill up the tank, don't even think about it. Gotta go to the grocery. Filling up the tank. The only time fossil fuels pass through your hand right there, and people don't even think about what they're doing. They're trying to remember if they got to pick up the dry cleaning. I apologize, but my apology won't do it. My apology is meaningless because I'm still part of this system, this cancerous, never-ending, ever-growing cancerous system. So, how do we get out of this mess? Starting now, we cut those emissions as quickly as we can, and we plant the CO2 back into the soil. That's why those lines are all dropping quickly at the beginning, and then they trail off, because there's a limit to how much CO2 we can store back into the soil around the earth. But here it is, 2013. We get back to 350 right around 2100. If we wait until the blue line, that's 2020, we get back to 350, 2300. That's 2.5 years from today. So what you and I do and don't do, what we buy and don't buy, the gas we burn and don't burn, changes what lives and dies on Earth for the next 300 years. Peak temperatures, water crisis, immigration, refugees, famines, you know, whatever the thing, whatever your nightmare is. Who said it? Humans decide what nature is and isn't. It used to be humans versus nature. No, we're past that. So what are we going to do? This is how much we have to cut emissions if we wait to start each year. This is from the lawsuit. 2020, we would need to cut about 12% emissions. If you wait until 2025 to start and say, okay, we're heading for 350. 350 is where life begins, right? Below 350, you can have possibly civilization, possibly most life forms on Earth today could go on for centuries and thousands of years. Below 350 somewhere. 25% CO2 reductions every year. I would rather start today. So this is poison. We ran out of time. There is no carbon budget left. That's all nonsense. And I'm culpable. I'm holding myself accountable. I've given this talk to way too many kids, to 13,000 students of all ages. I can't not hold myself accountable. I can't not believe the stuff that I'm teaching people, because I believe that the more we understand this, the more we understand what our fair share is and how accountable we can hold each other, I think then that maybe we have a chance of getting past some of this greed, this endless greed, because the truth is we do care about our kids. We all care about something, right? So, I'm going to say one more word, and that's about the trees. 1 trillion trees. Ridiculous number. The kids in Plant for the Planet have counted about 15 billion trees planted so far. That's over about 7 years, okay? They are not organized. They are not well funded. It's 12 people around the world and a bunch of, little scout troops, right? Ambassadors for climate justice. We're doing amazing things. Get a lot of great press, do a lot of good work, plant a lot of trees, raise a lot of awareness, do a lot of education. The kids do a slideshow. They go out and they do this, basically. They do it for the mayor and city council. It's awesome. 1 trillion trees is 150 trees per person alive on Earth today. Can you plant 150 trees? You might get blisters, but you can do it. Let me ask it again. For all life to come, will you plant 150 trees? It's different when I ask it that way. 1 trillion trees is impossible. I was going to curse there, but I didn't. 150 trees. I could plant, maybe for somebody else, I could plant 500 or 600 trees probably. You can plant a tree for $1 online. There's a dozen groups that'll plant all kinds of trees in all kinds of places. Is this possible? So I'm asking myself, is it possible? Yes, it is. I want to curse. It's possible. And if it's possible for you and me to change what lives and dies on the planet for centuries in the next couple of years by doing things differently, what is that? Why is that Ben & Jerry's so tempting? I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to buy that Ben & Jerry's. Right? For all life to come, I can make a change. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment before we start our Q&A, and I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and make a pledge. And it can be a tiny little trivial Ben & Jerry's pledge, like for Lent or something, I don't know. Or it can be something big and bold and crazy, like shutting down a pipeline, or anything in between. But the point is, you get to decide. But in this moment, when you've seen this kind of, mathematical, inevitable scenario, unless, give yourself the freedom, the agency to choose and to do something that matters, that you feel good about, to make a difference, big or small. So turn to somebody next to you, and then should we do Q&A after that? Yeah, okay, all right.
Jake.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, we're going to reconvene, if that's all right. Can I have your attention back here, please? Thank you. I just have a quick announcement, and then we're going to hear from Kenny and Jake. The Ecology Walk has been moved to start around 4:30 if you are interested in hiking the M. And we will just do that right after question and answers.
All right, so if you guys aren't tired from all this learning and pledging to save the planet today, there will be a Bring Your Own Brain kind of after party at Free Cycles this evening. It'll start at 5:30. There'll be food there. Dinner will be served around 6. It'll start out with some bluegrass, and around 7 o'clock we're going to have an open mic where we're inviting a lot of people to read poetry, maybe just do a little spiel about whatever they want. And then for around 8, we're just going to have music until pretty much somebody at Free Cycles kicks us out. So if you'd like to come there, there's no alcohol, no drugs or anything. Very straight edge, please. So yeah, if you'd like to come enjoy that with us as a little celebration, we'd love to see you. Is there anything you'd like to add, Jake?
If at this moment you're unable or unwilling to hike the M, we could use some help setting up. So it's mostly angled towards members of the group, but otherwise we're welcome to anyone. So thank you.
So we ran a little bit longer, but it sounds like we've got some time for questions and answers. I always think that's the best part. So we have. Can you hear us, Alice and Ted and Marla? Okay. Alice and Ted, are you still there?
I'm still there. I think Ted might have to jump off soon.
Yes,
okay.
I'll have to jump off in just a couple minutes, but I'm here for a little bit longer.
Okay, so if anybody has a question for Ted, you need to get in quick.
Hi, Ted. I was wondering if you could talk about what the historical precedent is for the necessity of defense, and if traditionally the moments where this public sense of morality seeps into the judge's head comes primarily from how jurors relate to the decisions they're forced to make because they couldn't do the necessity defense.
So in terms of, thanks for the question. In terms of the historical precedent, the necessity defense, unrelated to protests, is a very ancient part of the law. We've had it for centuries in a variety of contexts. The typical example is somebody's stuck in a blizzard, they're coming down a mountainside, they break into someone's cabin and eat their food so that they can survive, or start a fire so that they can survive. Scenarios like that, getting acquitted by reason of necessity for crimes like that, have been around for centuries. In the political protest context, it's really a creature of the last 30 or 40 years. Some anti-Vietnam War activists started to use it with mixed success. There was a lot more success in the 70s and 80s with protesters who are fighting nuclear power in particular, but also nuclear weapons. The Plowshares movement used this a lot. The Berrigan brothers had several cases where they brought attempted necessity defenses. One high-profile victory involved the 60s radical Abby Hoffman and the daughter of Jimmy Carter, Amy Carter, who trespassed and disrupted a CIA recruitment effort at the University of Massachusetts in the mid-'80s. They were acquitted by reason of necessity. And so this resistance that we're seeing from judges to the idea of climate necessity certainly isn't grounded in any sort of historical precedent against the use of necessity, or even against the use of necessity in the political protest context. And in Britain, in fact, in 2008, a group of activists drew the prime minister's name on the coal stack of the Kings North power plant. They brought a climate necessity defense after they were charged for that action, and they were acquitted. So there's been one international example of a full climate necessity trial and an acquittal. Your second question, I didn't quite catch the end of it, but I think it was about the relationship between the development of legal doctrine and public consciousness and what's going on in politics outside the courtroom. That's a very tough question. It's very, very hard to know how judges' politics and how their idea of the law develop. I think the general rule is that there's quite a bit of lag time between how favorable judges look at protest defendants and how society thinks about an issue. Marla's example of what the DA did in Massachusetts is a great symbol of how public consciousness, public feelings about climate change did influence a public official, and the way in which some judges have started to talk about climate change in some of these criminal trials is promising. You know, initially they wouldn't even engage with the climate science, or they would just say, clearly your protest could do nothing to address climate change. Now they'll often deny the climate necessity defense with more positive statements. They'll say something like, yes, we all agree that climate change is a very pressing issue and we admire your courage. However, the law won't allow me to recognize your defense. So there's slow progress, but you mentioned the jurors, and I really do think the jurors are what's important. We need to convince the judges so that we can get to the jurors, but this is about building grassroots power. This is about democratizing our approach to energy and to infrastructure. And so we'll do our best to get the legal arguments in shape, but what we really want to do is get a jury to ratify this idea, because that's a much better reflection of how society is thinking about this.
Hello, and thank you for spending some time with us today. My name is Jay, and I was going to just maybe ask the group of you, maybe you have an answer to this. Can you maybe cite the largest single site mass arrest in U.S. history, and maybe tell us what that was, like number-wise? I mean, I've heard some, you know, big arrests through Occupy and some other things, and I'm just curious what that is. And the second thing is, you know, all of you are probably familiar with the School of the Americas, and you know, each year, you know, 15 to 20,000 people gather down there, and I'm wondering, you know, 5 people go in, and then there's going to be 5 jury trials, but if all 20,000 cross the line, what kind of constitutional crisis or legal crisis that would cause for Georgia state law or state officials, and what that would be like? I'd be really curious to hear your reaction if there was a mass arrest of the order of maybe 100,000 people at one site, not dispersed.
So maybe I'll go first, and Alice and Ted can fill in some of the details that I'm going to miss. I would say, first of all, if you have 100,000 people who are committing acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, 100,000 people will not be arrested. It's not possible. And the larger the groups are, the more likely it is that the authorities are going to say, we don't actually have the capacity to arrest these people, and particularly if actions are nonviolent, and they often don't have any intention to do so, or you know, there's no motivation for them to do so. It would just cause a lot more problems for them than allowing things to go on. I don't have an answer at all for the largest number of people arrested at once. I will say that that when you get to larger and larger groups taking a mass action together, it's a lot harder to establish a situation in which everybody's holding the same intention about how they're going to carry themselves, and that could be okay. It's also good to know that going into a situation like that. But that sort of mass demonstration, it doesn't have to get near that big. 100 people at once refusing in one place, particularly in a small town, could make an enormous amount of difference, and could accomplish shutting something down for quite a long time, while people tried to decide what to do with them.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything Marla said. I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, there have been a lot of examples of mass protests throughout history. A lot of them are forgotten, unfortunately. I'm sure there were, you know, a lot of protests during that era I mentioned in the 19-teens when everyone was striking over labor practices. Also, you know, the civil rights movement, you mentioned Occupy. One thing that's great about the really big protests, as Marla said, is that it really makes it harder for the prosecutor, for the local law enforcement to process all of those cases, depending on where you are. But, you know, as we saw at Standing Rock, when you're in a place like rural North Dakota, the system just isn't set up to handle that much, you know, that much activity. And so a lot of times it's easier to kind of you have more bargaining power when you're talking about trying to get charges dismissed. But it can also mean that, people are getting bused all over the state to be held in, jails far away and things like that. So it's important with those mass actions that there's a good organizational structure, as Marla said, to make sure that everyone knows what the risks are and that they're willing to take on those risks.
Financial risks you've actually encountered and what the ramifications have been for you? And is there a volunteer list to sign up for civil disobedience?
Thank you.
I really didn't hear any of that question.
So the question is, what are the financial risks and potential consequences we're facing? And what are the potential risks? And finally, where do people sign up if they're interested, like in a pledge of resistance to take direct action? And so I'll start just with what I face, and Michael can do the same. So in terms of the criminal charges, I'm facing a $50,000 fine, including to the maximum prison sentence of 10 years. And there's a possibility, if convicted, that there could be a civil case pressing charges for restitution for damages. And so there is significant financial risk as well as the criminal charges.
Yeah, it's good to be aware of that. And we talked about it a lot planning the event, whether we were wanting to do something that would have minimal risk or higher risk, whether we wanted to be in state courts or in federal court. And these are all things that you can explore in great detail when you're in the planning phase, and take as long as you want to kind of weigh those options. Yeah.
Which, by the way, we were in the planning phase for 4 or 5 months. Before we were ready to take the action. Any thoughts about the financial risks? And do you want to talk, Marla, about, and for that matter, Michael, I'm not sure here in Missoula, in Montana, if you have any kind of pledge of resistance kinds of sign-ups going, whether 350 Montana might have something like that, or Rocky Mountain Rising Tide.
I'd like to invite you to have one. Shutdown Chase. Shutdown Chase is something that happened May 8th in Seattle. About 200 people were involved. We shut down 13 Chase Bank branches, and about 26 people were arrested. 4 of them were arrested the Friday before as kind of a shot across the bow. Chase had been invited to sign a pledge that they would no longer invest in fossil fuel infrastructure or loan money to anybody like Trans Mountain Pipeline or Keystone XL. And city council member came out, made the announcement with us. A city council candidate was the first person to get arrested. And we disrupted business and sent letters to Jamie Dimon and had a great time. It was a great event. So we're going to try to roll it out as a template for groups to join nationwide. So anybody who has a Chase Bank in your neighborhood and wants to make some noise. Some of the branches shut down with posters out on the sidewalk, and the bank managers was just like, oh, they're here, they're coming, close the doors, everybody go home. And they shut down for the day. Others, people were like locking their necks to the doors of the branch with bike locks, and everything in between. There were people who were praying in a bank. Native leaders took the downtown branch and sang and prayed and danced for hours while we live streamed, and the police wouldn't touch them. So it was a really powerful event, and every group decided how they were going to do their neighborhood shutdown. So look up Shutdown Chase online. Monday the 19th, we're going to have another shutdown. and we're going to try and do them weekly. Yeah.
And so there's all different kinds of ways of resisting. If you do want to take direct action, another option is that after Standing Rock, there was like a distribution of small groups that had spent time at Standing Rock. So at sites all over the U.S. now in fights against fossil fuel infrastructure. For instance, in my area on the coast near Coos Bay, there's a liquid natural gas export facility proposed called Jordan Cove, and a long pipeline called the Pacific Connector Pipeline. And we have a group of about 15 folks, young folks, that were at Standing Rock that have come to help with stopping that project.
So this is maybe more just of a comment, but I know that for the break-free, here we go, for the break-free Anacortes action, I think we had 250 people pledging to risk arrest, but the design of the action was such that really only 52 people, I think, ended up actually being arrested. So I think that's a question too for the movement, how we design actions going forward so that all those people who went through the training and felt comfortable and were ready to do it, but couldn't sleep on the tracks necessarily and wait all night for the police or for whatever reason. You know, if we're going to think about larger arrest scenarios, how would we design those so that it's easy for housewives, guys that have to go to work the next week, everybody can get involved, not just what we might call the guys that are always getting arrested and can afford to do that.
I have an answer.
Go ahead.
Could you mute it again? There's a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
So this organization that I helped to build, that I worked with, called Resist the Pipeline. You can go to resistthepipeline.org if you want to see some of the work that we did to address that kind of question. We decided that instead, so we had a pledge of resistance, and about 800 people signed it. And when they signed it, they knew they were going to that we were going to call on them pretty soon. And we ended up training about 600 people. We had a training every week on Wednesday night. It was open. We just decided to be open and make it as easy as possible for people to come. Sometimes we announced our actions before we did them, so it was easier for people to come. And so there are a lot of different ways to do this. We wanted to have a lot of people that look like just regular folks who live in your neighborhood, wherever your neighborhood is, standing on the sidewalk, cheering for and supporting people visibly who were, jumping in a pipeline trench to block active construction. And so instead of trying to amass everybody to do an action like that at one moment, we knew that even if we brought all 800 of those people at once, that we would probably block it for a day, maybe 2 days. But instead, we took action over the course of a year, and we ended up costing the company 7 weeks of work that we actually physically blocked, if you add up all the hours. And they ended up going home for the winter, hoping that we would forget and do something else in the meantime, when they weren't planning to go home for the winter. So that was like another 4 months, because winter is long here. That was like another 4 months of work that we blocked. And so we have to keep being creative. We have to keep finding ways for everybody who wants to get involved to be able to find us and to figure out how it is that somebody like them, with whatever risk tolerance they have, or whatever risk tolerance we can inspire them to, that they understand that there's a role for them. If this work is going to actually create change across our society and not just be a stunt, and I'm not suggesting anything we just talked about was a stunt, because it wasn't, but it's easy for people to look at our actions and feel like that's a stunt. If they don't see people who look like them either doing the action or actively supporting it. And if it's a one-off thing sometimes, especially if it's not huge and it's a one-off thing. So part of the work I do is to try to help people figure out, and try to help myself continue to figure out what it is that we can do to unmask the violence that goes on under our noses every day that we've taught ourselves how not to see. Whether that they're digging a pipeline trench in the street that you use to get somewhere, and you don't ask yourself whether that's repair or new construction, or they're trying to put it in a new natural gas terminal. If you're not going to have to see it, we generally have taught ourselves not to understand that as an act of violence, when really any of these new projects are creating sacrifice zones and committing us to more dramatic catastrophe climate-wise, because it's moving us further into the hole instead of helping us to climb out.
So I wanted to, I'll unmute. So I wanted to make a comment. I see looks like you have a question, just real quick. So, it hasn't always happened in our democracy, but it has happened some. We have a duty as citizens, if we see injustice, if we see unjust acts, if we have unjust laws, to stand up as citizens against that. And we've seen some of that in the history of our country. Things that we were taught in school, like the Boston Tea Party, the American Revolution. There's a history of that. There's also a history of genocide and ecocide, things that have been done in our country that us as citizens, my ancestors did not stand up, did not fight against. And that flavors and that influences the character of our government, whether we have a democracy or not. And so whether we're explicitly giving permission, giving our consent for the continuing raping of the earth or not, if we're not standing up against these injustices, we're participating. We're actually giving our consent as citizens for this going on. And so I do look at it as a moral, as a civic, and even a patriotic, for those of us that still have some tiny sense of patriotism, to the countrymen and women that all are part of our larger community. And so I just wanted to comment on that. You had a comment or a question.
Hi, I'm Luke. I really appreciate the work you guys are all doing, and I found this, I don't know, something about this particular presentation to be pretty moving for a lot of different reasons. I guess I have a couple of comments and a question. First of all, for me personally, I felt like what you were saying about the tree planting, that's something that resonates with me. I just wanted to, that's something I've been looking into, and just wanted to maybe comment/question about the nature of the tree planting, because looking into that, I've done some research about how certain trees can actually contribute to warming because of the lack of reflectivity, that other trees have better characteristics for reflecting. For example, study done I think in the UK that showed the planting of conifer forests in say a field where it would have a higher albedo effect. The net effect was actually a warming, whereas certain types of trees would be more reflective, and fast growing. So I'm just wondering how you select the certain tree species in relation to where they're going. And also just mention, I noticed there are some issues too about like online planting tree things can be a scam, and so how if you're giving money $1, say, to plant a tree, like how how that tree is being treated. And then I guess just a wider question to everybody. It seems like, the things that have been brought up in the discussion today, when we're talking about, say, 90 to 100% fossil fuel reduction by 2100 by 2050 is necessary, or say a 12% reduction every year to get it by 2100. These are massive things that we're being asked to do. And so I'm saying is, it seems to me that in order to achieve these goals, we're all going to have to step outside of our comfort zones. It's not just up to you guys to do it. It's up to all of us to kind of assess where our comfort zones are and how do we go beyond those. And so how do you, on a personal level, how do you go about doing that in your own lives? How do you prepare yourselves to do that? You know, what kind of thought processes go into that? And then how do you communicate to others the necessity for them to do that without intimidating them or shutting them down?
So the tree thing, start with that, that's easy. That kind of research, that kind of interest and your focus on carbon and albedo, whether the trees are going to be viable there in 20 or 30 or 40 years, because like Doug firs are not going to be viable in most of the Pacific Northwest by 2080. So we have to, you know, think about that. If you're thinking about that and you're learning and you're curious about that, I guarantee you the U.S. Forest Service is not. You're a citizen. Place the call. If enough people like you are thinking that way and make the call to the Forest Service, they're going to get curious and they're going to start asking those questions internally. So absolutely, absolutely. And I won't spend any more time on it. Same thing with the $1 a tree thing. Absolutely. You look at any of those sites and some of them look like there's no way this could be real. Some of them have all kinds of, they're conscientious and they're doing amazing things. There's any kind of tree planting you can imagine. You can find it online and then it's up to you. Point is, we got to plant 1 trillion of them. It's about 1,000 times more than anybody thinks is possible. Right? So let's get started. And then the discomfort, absolutely. I'm so uncomfortable going into the grocery store. I'm so uncomfortable looking at all this stuff in this room that's from China. I'm losing my comfort zone every day just by opening my eyes and just seeing what's in front of me, and trying to be aware of the carbon cost to my kids of the poisons that I see us buying and selling. I'm a consumer. I have agency. I can decide. And if I can't decide, if I'm forced into a choice, then my choice is to force somebody to give me a choice. Right? That's what I'm going to commit myself to. If there's no choice for me, then I have the choice to decide I'm going to force another choice. So Chase, no more fossil fuels. I don't even have a Chase account, whatever. So becoming more uncomfortable in our abundance and seeing it as the point that everything I do for my kids to privilege my kids is the stuff that will poison them. No doubt. I cannot accept $1 or spend $1 without somebody gives it to me because they have a giant carbon footprint. I'm going to spend it. I'm going to, even planting a tree with an organization. The people that work for that organization, they probably have bigger carbon footprints than I wish, right? I'm paying for somebody's time to plant that tree. So I have to just be so uncomfortable, right, that like going to prison, man, that's going to be a relief. And if they give me an email, I'm going to sue them for like cruel and unusual punishment because I don't want that thing.
And so it occurs to me, when Michael talks about trying to avoid money, I want to mention that in the group here is George Price, and he's written a long piece, an essay about the end of money, and I don't know if he wants to speak to that, but that's another part of the work we're going to hear tomorrow, I think, about donut economics, and I think it's another way of moving away from the damage that's being done. Marla, did you want to talk you part of the mission, as I understand it, of the Climate Disobedience Center is preparing people to take these kinds of actions. Did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I really want to echo Michael's encouragement to find a way to either stretch your comfort zone, or find a way to be able to cope with living outside of it most of the time. But it's a lot easier said than done, I think, and so I don't want to gloss over it. And so one of the things that we focus on is being really, really important in this time, when more and more people really do need to be taking some legal risks and stepping outside of their comfort zones in a number of ways, is the creation of deeper, I mentioned this before, communities of support, and also finding your own ways to cope. For a number of years, I was directing a program called Climate Summer, and we put young adults on bicycles for the summer, and they would travel from town to town in small groups. They wouldn't get in a car the whole summer, and they'd be doing climate organizing throughout the summer. And you know, as the campus divestment movement grew, more and more of the students who came to us for the summer are people ages 18 to 25. They didn't have to be students, but more and more of the folks had some real organizing experience that they'd learned through campus divestment. And so I began to assume that meant that they had done a little bit more work to deal emotionally with how they felt about climate change and what was probably going to be required of all of us. And it turned out that every year we asked the same question on the first evening of the program, and it was, you know, what do you do to cope with the despair that you feel when you allow yourself to sit with the reality of what we're facing? And every year, as we had more organizers, experienced organizers who knew a lot about climate change in the program, we had fewer people who even tried to cope with how they felt about it emotionally. And that's not it's not a good long-term strategy. And this is going to be a lifelong, this problem, you know, is not likely to be solved adequately where we can stop working on it in any of our lifetimes. And the answer I kept getting was, I don't let myself think about it. And that's really not a good long-term strategy. So I can't give you one answer for how to develop a coping mechanism to allow yourself to deal with any of the grief about the reality that we face. But I can say that for the four of us who founded the Climate Disobedience Center, one thing that we all agree on is that we have become our most powerful selves in this work after we have allowed ourselves to experience that grief and to move through it. It's not that we don't feel it anymore, but there's a kind of freedom coming out the other side, recognizing, allowing ourselves to deal with the enormity of the crisis, particularly if we're gentle enough with ourselves to recognize that it is not the responsibility of any of us to fix it alone, and people don't fix things like this alone. So I'd say build a community and find your way to cope with your discomfort. Search for it until you find it, and find people who support you in your willingness to be pushed to take a little bit more risk. You keep challenging yourself, and then go back to being gentle with yourself when you need it for a minute, but maybe just a minute.
Well, I'm going to have to end things here. We're at 4:30. We've got a lot of stuff to do, so I want to thank Marla and Alice and Leonard and Michael in just a second. But just a couple of kind of closing comments, just so that you're kind of familiar, maybe a little bit more with what the students have organized here. And I really appreciate your comments there at the end, Marla, because one of the things that they're a concept or a model they've come up with from this symposium is something called critical thinking communities, and the idea is to build communities wherever they go. So it was interesting when you asked for pledges, Michael. I was sitting in the back with the students, and the number of them that actually pledged a lot of things you thought might be about consumption, but the number of them that said, I'm pledging that when I go off to college next year, and some are going to, all over the country, that I'm going to start a critical thinking community, which would be a place that they would start to build resilience, where they would start to have thought and start to talk about the condition that they're in, the amazing things they learned from the speakers that participated here, and try to start sharing those ideas. And I was really heartened by that idea. I thought they were going to say something like give up ice cream. And I really preferred that they said that, and I know it's a little self-serving for what we've done here. At the same time, one thing that I want to, I don't want to share this publicly. Leonard came and visited. I don't know where to look, the camera here or look at you guys, but I challenged Leonard, and part of what I challenged Leonard on when he spoke with the students is a concern I have with individual action. And even in the language that I hear you using now, it seems so much, and I know we have to kind of go through personal spaces in order to change, but that we use a language that's something we've been encouraged by so many of our speakers throughout this week to change the language, and I think some of it's the language about individual choice. And to treat civil disobedience, to me, as an individual choice is a problem. I find it very problematic, because then when we are going through it individually, we're not going through it as going through all of this together. And that's why I brought up the concept. So I'm actually going to put it out there in the universe. 350.org says that they have 99,000 people pledged to do civil disobedience and be willing to be arrested. And so I kind of feel like upping the stakes on ourselves is an important thing. And years ago I speculated with a colleague and friend of mine, if Occupy was staged actually by the right to show the feebleness of the left, that we're disorganized, that we don't really have a coherent strategy. And of course it was just a thought experiment. And so one of the reasons I asked for us to consider changing the game and the sort of activist playbook is because we have to question if it's working. And to me, it doesn't seem to be doing Chomsky's adage, which is we have to figure out ways to raise the cost of doing business as usual. And I don't think we're doing that. So when I look at what you've accomplished with your work, and then the courage of the valve turners and many other people, I'd love to see it pushed to a different paradigm. Michael mentioned some arrests that took place in May at Chase Bank, and it bothers me that people don't, maybe some did in the room, but that a lot of people don't know about that, and that once again you see people getting picked off as individuals, and perhaps you feel that it's a part of a bigger strategy, but I'm hoping that we consider whether or not it's the right strategy, and that we wouldn't say let's reserve that moment for the right moment big enough and challenge ourselves and draw a line in the sand on ourselves and say, how serious are we? And if 99,000 people say they're pledging and willing to get arrested, let's see it happen in one spot, one day. And imagine that. You want to talk about building a party and a movement and all these things? Bring them together. So that's something I wanted to put out there and continue this conversation. But thank you very much for your time, and thanks for sharing with our students. And I hope we collaborate in the future. And I hope we get to see you guys. So if you'd give it up for these guys. There's an after party, and we'd love to have everyone join us. It starts at 5:30. It's the free cycles. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.